Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today for a very interesting conversation about infrastructure on the continent of Africa. I am seeking to have a talk generally about infrastructure on the continent, and then we'll try and zoom in into some interesting aspects of that infrastructure investment on the continent. One part that we'll go into is going to be on energy, because energy is key for development, and we'll try and answer the questions of whether the existing energy production on the continent is enough, if the financing works, and what can be improved, what opportunities are there. For this conversation today, I have a very good friend of mine, Ope Onibokun. He's an investment professional who has worked in infrastructure for the past decade and a half. In investments, not just in Africa, but in Asia and the US as well. He's worked for Citi, Rise, and most recently for the British International Investment. So with those few words, welcome, Ope.
Thank you, Sam, for having me on your podcast.
I'm glad you were able to join me. So just to kind of like start overall picture of the infrastructure space on the continent. What does the landscape currently look like? How attractive is it for investment? What are the gaps that exist? If you're just to paint a bigger picture of the continent's infrastructure as it is in 2025.
So to start off with, I'd like to paint a picture of, I'll say, what the bottlenecks are or what the pain points are. So let's take, for example, in the sector of transportation and ports. If you are a consumer based somewhere, perhaps in the middle of Addis, or you might be somewhere in Nairobi, a landlocked country, a lot of goods that we import or we use in Africa are mainly imported. Unfortunately, the manufacturing base in Africa is very little, so a lot of it is imported. So it's imported via mainly container cargo, most likely from Asia, China, or Europe. It lands in one of the ports around East Africa. So it could be, Port of Dar, could be, the ports in Lamu, it could be a port in Mombasa. You then have to figure out how you then truck it through the road networks. We know, for example, that the roads in Africa are not the number of roads in Africa, in terms of how good they are, they're not very good, right? It's lots of potholes, not very tarred, not many tarred roads compared to other markets in the world. I think Africa has the lowest potentially kilometers of tarred roads versus population compared to other parts of the world. And in the port itself, when the goods containers land, there's a lot of congestion because of some of the inefficiencies. Perhaps it takes a long. We don't have the most advanced equipment handling systems to get the cargoes, unloaded and then transported. So you don't have the transport problem, the roads. And then there's also an issue around the last mile delivery. For you to get to your house, Sam, wherever you're in Addis, it's very complex and it adds a lot of cost. In fact, it may be even cheaper to transport the good from China, somewhere in Shanghai, to Port of Mombasa, and more expensive to get it from Mombasa to where you are, in Addis Ababa. So that's one of the pain points we have in terms of transportation. We go to the energy sector in the electricity. Across the world, Africa unfortunately has the most number of least people that are connected to electricity or grid connected. I think it's over 300 million people. I think I have to get that data correct. But we have the highest number. Whereas in markets like Asia, over many years, the level of electrification has actually increased. Whereas in Africa, it's not really improving as drastically as we would like it to be. So there's an issue there around electricity. And without power, it's hard to encourage manufacturing. It's hard to even have small, medium businesses. Even if you wanted to open a small barber shop, you need energy to power that up. So you have that issue as well. And where there's access to power, it's either run by inefficient diesel, petrol generators, or thermal assets that are also expensive, whether it's gas or HFO. So that's in the power sector. In the water sector, the story is the same. We don't have very efficient water sanitation or water supply to many households in several cities. I remember when I lived in Cape Town, there was an issue around day zero, whereby Cape Town water reservoirs were running low. And there seemed to be a lot of media attention to the plight that Cape Town water levels are going low. And it was a crisis. It was on CNN, it was on BBC. People encouraging tourists not to go because there's a crisis, there's a day zero. And I kind of sat back and laughed. I'm like, Cape Town is way, way, way better, even a scenario than almost many African cities, whereby on a daily basis there is day zero. There's a crisis, right? However, Cape Town seemed to be everybody was panicking, and I had to use like a bucket of water to control my water flow. But in many African cities, there's no the tap. You open the tap, it doesn't work. There's no sanitation, so there is day zeros in African cities because of lack of water. So this is the crisis that we find ourselves in, and I've just mentioned three broad sectors. Now, with crisis, so with challenges, there comes opportunities. On the opportunity side, you have a demographic that is growing in terms of population size. You have a young population. On average, the future growth, GDP growth still favors Africa. I think Africa is still a lot of opportunities for growth, right? And for that reason, I think the AFDB did the studies that there's $100 billion infrastructure gap. Just to plug the gap, when you look at, the governments are trying their best with funding from like taxpayer funding, borrowing debt, bank funding, DFIs, but there's still $100 billion gap on an annual basis that exists that has to be plugged. So I think that's where the opportunity is, that if you can then invest in some of this core infrastructure, this would be big enablers for growth that Africa needs. So I'll pause there, but I think that gives you a landscape of where we are, I guess, the crisis, but the opportunity that arises, that if we can invest in infrastructure, I think we can hopefully start to grow and leapfrog.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially the fact that many African cities and even rural parts of the continent are living in day zeros, because it just became a big issue in Cape Town because we did not expect it in Cape Town. We'll get back to the financing aspect of it, and thank you for mentioning the $100 billion gap that AFDB mentioned. But on the other side, because we do hear a lot about the investment that has already happened in the digital space, is there a gap in the digital space on the continent as well, or are we doing better? Because we know in countries like Kenya, digital space is very robust and mature, but in other countries, maybe in Chad or Burundi, do we have that investment there? What is your view of the digital infrastructure investment?
So in the digital infrastructure space, you rightly mentioned, I think there's been growth in the sector, especially, for example, mobile connection has increased significantly with the likes of MTN, Vodacom, and the other MNOs that operate in Africa. You've seen an increase in penetration of mobile access, and also increase in number of mobile smartphones as well, whereby people are connected. So I think in terms of like people, the likes of Facebook, they probably have one of the highest growth in Africa because a lot of people are connected online over at Instagram, and that has created a lot of opportunities to connect people to the global economy, whether it's in the area of music for streaming, for example. A lot of people can now, or if you're in Africa, like even we're doing this podcast or wherever you can be, as long as you're connected to the internet, you're able to publish your content to the global audience, and that potentially could help you earn a revenue. Whether it's in producing movies with Netflix, you can produce, have access to what your favorite Netflix TV show or African soap opera or Nollywood movie right from your home, and also the African audience gets to benefit and watch that. So also, I think also in the areas of like, there's been a lot of investments, especially in the coastal cities, whether it's in Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, whereby you have fiber connection. Having said that, the cost remains still high. So when you compare the cost of per megabytes for the African average user to those in the West, there's a significant gap there. So it's still expensive for the average African user. And remember, the disposable income or the average income, or even the GDP per capita for many African countries are on average $1,000, $2,000. Is a GDP per capita. In the US, in the West, it's 50, 60,000. So there's the poor people who can afford it are paying more for data than those who actually can afford it and are paying less. Of course, this all comes with economies of scale and other factors in there. So there's still a gap around affordability, which remains an issue. But having said that, from where we've come from, there's been a lot of growth in the space. And because of the advent of, again, of the internet and connectivity, you've seen a lot of like fintech startups or startups being built that leverage the internet as their base to build over the top applications, like fintech applications that help, for example, with money, remittances. So now you don't have to go to Western Union or MoneyGrant in some shop. You can do it from your home and send money to your loved ones, both internationally and externally. You can also import, export goods. So it's brought a lot of growth. But then in their markets, to your point, perhaps, it's easier, more in the coast, but places, Africa is very landlocked. So countries like Chad, Burundi, those countries, I'm sure, one, the cost is really, really high. The speeds are really, really slow. There's still a big gap. However, I think with Elon Musk Starlink, that's also helping out because now you have very hard to reach places, able to get access to internet with the use of, or Starlink. So I think that helps out. I think he's done a great job of trying to bring down the cost. But I believe if we're able to have more connectivity with Starlink, and I know the likes of Facebook, Google are also helping to create low costs access to the internet. I think that would help create a big drive to connect the 1.2 billion people in Africa to the internet. Right now, the connection is still very low, but there's also a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah. And speaking of gaps again, I know you did mention that it probably costs more to transport your goods from the port to the end user than from the producer, say in Asia, to the port.
Yeah.
But on the port itself, because I want us to that a little bit later, is there an existing gap with the ports across the African continent all around? I know you mentioned there's a lot of inefficiencies and sometimes too much load coming. How is that looking like right now? Are there some countries that are doing much better? Are we seeing a lot of interest and investments going to that side?
I think right now you are seeing a lot of investments in port infrastructure across Africa. It's almost a race among some of the big players. The port space is still almost it's sector to invest in the port. It's almost like a natural monopoly. For example, in Africa, if you have the ports of Mombasa, that one port itself, it's because these ports are also governed by concessions. You have to have a regulated, so you can't just go open the port anywhere you want to. The government has to give a license or concession. Many of these concessions actually have a lot of protection against competition from other ports that are close by. So effectively, all the goods that flow into a country like Kenya, or if it's Lagos, there are a few ports there, have to go in through certain ports, and that creates, of course, you get your demand there. And also in terms of pricing, these ports are dollarized tariffs, which also makes it attractive for foreign investors. So you've seen historically, we've always had, if I was to think about the transition, I guess historically ports were mainly nationalized. So governments controlled perhaps in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's kind of what you had. But as time went by, and they saw that there's a lot of inefficiencies. For example, the governments didn't have the revenue to invest in the required equipment and capex to make sure the ports are modernized. It's concession out the ports. So you then saw a concession in certain countries, not all countries, but for example, in Nigeria, the ports in Apapa have a concession to different ports operators. Similarly, in many of in Ivory Coast, in Senegal. And historically, you had more the European port operators operating there, the likes of TIL, which is owned by the MSC Group, the likes of AGL, African Global Logistics, formerly Bolloré, which is now owned also by the MSC Group. And you also had the likes of CMA-CGM. So the European players were the ones who had operated those ports. But now with the growth of the Middle Eastern or Gulf players, you also have in competition for the likes of Dubai Port World, DP World, Abu Dhabi Port World, ED Port, and also the Asian, giants as well, like ICTSI, which is Filipino-based, owned, and also the Chinese as well. So I think you're now seeing a lot of competition from these port players. to own port assets in different African countries. However, there are only a few, so they're competing for the few port concessions that have been awarded, knowing fully well that with this access to these ports, they can serve many of the inland countries. So it remains very profitable, the port space. And also when you look at trade routes, for example, you look at the Horn of Africa, if you're going to take trade from Europe to the Americas, you might have to go through like the west part of Africa to get to the US. And you might have to create a hub, somewhere in Africa where your ships, lay over, if you're using aviation terms. So you have big hubs in Tangiers, also now being big hubs based in Lomé, also in Dakar that will be built. So I think Africa remains a very strategic location in terms of shipping routes. And on the other side of the continent, where you historically have the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Coast, which is where historically the trade routes have gone along the route. When you have crisis in the Red Sea, all those ports, all those vessels are diverted across towards the Cape, towards South Africa, to get to the US or to get to the market. So Africa still remains a very strategic location in terms of trade of shipping, and that's why you have this competition from the players. So I think if also summarize terms of like what is driving it, of course, there's been a population growth. You have the 1.2 billion people have to eat. You have to import and export goods. Of course, there's also multi-containerized. And then you also have the fact that a lot of these ports still operate as a monopoly. So the economics make sense. The revenues are actually dollarized, unlike, perhaps in the power sector, which is more of exposed to, you need a lot more government subsidies to make it sustainable. In the port sector, you don't need as much. It's profitable. It's not. You don't need subsidies to operate ports. It's fully liberalized and it's concession based. So I think these drivers make it attractive for, where Africa, makes Africa attractive.
Just to get an understanding of how the global business works, are the rest of the port business outside of Africa still profitable? Are going in, say, South America, Europe, Asia?
Yeah, so they remain profitable globally overall, especially in the last couple of years, I guess, with COVID, because there was during COVID, a lot of the port players the port operators actually made the revenues increased. And so it remains profitable. I think what you're seeing, of course, is around efficiencies in how this port operates. One, through decarbonization efforts to make them more greener, but also just using a lot more, making them less manual. So many ports, for example, are almost semi or fully autonomous. Those are the cranes that move them from one part of the port to another. So those efficiencies have also helped to increase profitability, at least for the for the port, both for the shipping lines, and also global trade is still increasing, right? I think the global growth, GDP growth globally is meant to be about, I think the latest IMF report be equal to 1 to 2% or whatever the number is, but it's still growing, it's not contracting. And as you have more global trade, there's a need to get goods from one part of the world to another. So I think you still see a lot of profitability. And then also, I think what potentially makes Africa slightly different from many markets is that many of these markets, if you're a US port player, your containers are full on both legs. So you're importing goods, whether it's from Asia, from Africa, but also because you're a manufacturing hub, you're also exporting as well. So that makes it very profitable. Similar in Asia, there's import and outflow. So the containers are actually full on both sides. In Africa, a lot of it is imports. They are exports from a containerized perspective, but it's not as much, right? So you see when you look at the figures, it's mostly going to be 60% imports, and the exports are mainly empties. And if you're exporting any cargo, it's mainly maybe, not processed or manufactured goods. So I think there's more Africa could do, going back to Africa again, in terms of ensuring that the trade on both sides actually makes it just competitive. And so for that reason, the cost to imports counts, so there's not that much export, so the price remains high, But if there was a lot more volumes, perhaps the price would potentially go down for African imports and exports.
That is interesting. So in essence, if you're a country that does export finished goods, let's say South Africa, the cost of imports to South Africa is going to be cheaper than, say, a country that does not produce finished goods for export because you're sending out empties.
Potentially, in terms of just like a volume game, effectively. I mean, the math potentially makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That's a very interesting point that I don't think a lot consider. Okay, so let me just move into the continent now. So once everything gets to the port, there are challenges between countries, especially when you're doing cross-border trade and cross-border transportation. But is the Africa Free Trade Zone going to make any improvement, either short-term or long-term, for any of this cross-border, both cross-border infrastructure projects as well as trade? What do you think?
Yes, Sam. So we have to be optimistic that yes, on paper, the Africa Free Trade Agreement, AFCTA, it's a great initiative in the right direction to ensure and make it easy for have cross-border trade of goods and also of people and movements. I think in the long term, it would work very well potentially and act almost in the EU where you have the EU bloc and they trade and it's a similar trade going through the EU. I think right now, Africa still suffers from the impact of colonization and balkanization of very different countries. So you have all these different countries. Everybody wants to almost try to remain autonomous and not give out any sovereignty or any, give up access easily. So as of today, it's perhaps easier for Africa to trade with Europe or Asia than it is for Africa to trade with each other. So I'm sure the cost of getting goods, for example, like I said, from Shanghai to China, from Shanghai or from Guangzhou to, let's say, Mombasa or Lagos is probably cheaper than if you want to get a good Mombasa to, Addis or from Lagos to Abidjan. It's probably going to be more expensive. It also applies well in terms of like flights as well. It's cheaper to fly internationally or to Europe from Africa than to fly between African countries. One, the time it takes and also the cost. I think these are the issues that we have. And some of the reasons could also be around the monetary policies that we have. So almost all the countries, 52 or 54 countries have their own currencies, except for the Francophone countries in West and Central Africa that may have a common union. But other countries have their own currency, which makes it also then difficult to trade and buy goods and services. And then you have the issue of infrastructure, whereby the road access between countries is not efficient. So it's really hard to get goods across the border. Because at the border, there's going to be like several checkpoints, and you know how it works. You might spend 3, 4, 5 days waiting at the border to get your goods cleared or to travel across the border. It's very painful. As an example, I'm Nigerian, and I would love, for example, to do a road trip from Lagos to Abidjan, but I have to go to like maybe 4 or 5 countries. And I know that if I have to do that road trip, I will potentially be stopped at every border and I have to deal. It's going to take me a longer time. Yeah. It's going to be very painful, even though it's potentially a scenic route, then it's just perhaps easier for me to just fly without the hassle. So you have all these bottlenecks that are in place that impedes trade. So now, what would the AFCTA help solve? I think they're trying to help have a common union. I know there's discussions being out, so how do we further optimize that? One of the things that have been discussed also around just free movement of people. Let's start with that. So removing the need for having visas to travel across different countries. Some countries are taking bold steps, like Kenya, for example, Rwanda, to say, you know what, if you're African, you don't need a visa to visit these countries. I think we need more of that. And then we need more integration, not just within the region, but across regions. For example, I think if the 3 big powerhouses, I'll say 4, even Nigeria, South Africa, perhaps Egypt, and let's say Abidjan, are able to really coordinate better. I think these 4, let's also add Kenya there too. These 4 countries can really like help galvanize and drive right. So like in Europe, for example, the way I see it, the European, I guess, let's say solution is being driven by Germany, France, and those 3 countries pretty much drive and help push and take a lead. Historically, they were enemies, they fought many wars, but right now they say, you know what, let's collaborate and let's move the continent forward. So I think we only need like 3 or 4 countries, say let's sit together and drive the changes we need. So again, it's heading in the right direction. But I think what also impacts is also the regular change in governments, right? Either through coups or through the multiple elections, whereby there's lack of consistency. I remember during the era of Obasanjo, who was the president of Nigeria from 1999 to about 2007 or 8 or so, there was strong collaboration between him and the likes of Thabo Mbeki in South Africa. And during that time, you saw a lot of growth and trade. That's when MTN came to Nigeria. That's when institutes like the AFC were formed. Institutes in South Africa were also formed to help drive this Pan-African agenda. But when there was changing governments in South Africa, you then had Zuma come in, and in Nigeria, you had a new government. That changed. And I wish that collaboration continued. Similarly, you have the dynamics whereby, depending on who's president in East Africa, you might have, Kenyatta is friends with, let's say, the president of Uganda or of Rwanda, but then someone else changes and that dynamic changes, right? So there's this rivalry that occurs, which is wrong. I think one of the things we need to do as a continent is to really sit back and say, guys, we've always been governed in Africa by divide and conquer from the time of slavery to colonization. And that's the continuous, whereby we are fighting with each other. We should look at ourselves as not enemies. We need to find a way to collaborate and fight in quote the enemy. I think the enemy here is not necessarily an enemy, but it's more around Africa is competing with other regions around the world, with Asia, with America, those are competitors. So how do we compete and be on the same level as they are? And the way to compete is to collaborate, to cooperate, and to really maximize on what our strengths are. 1.2 billion population, a GDP that is massive, over $2 trillion GDP. But when you also even look at Africa and the Africans as well, do you know that the country with the largest number of Black people in the world after Nigeria and Ethiopia, you know what it is? The number of Black people. It's not in Africa. It's Brazil. 40% of Brazilians are actually Black or identify as Black, and that's almost 100 million people. Colombia as well, Dominican Republic. We have a large Black population in these countries. So when you combine all that together, plus the GDP in America of African Americans, it's almost 4 trillion. So we have ourselves our own block to trade with and whereby we can be prosperous. I think we just need to have them who sit down and think big picture to make the AFCTA. That's my view on the AFCTA.
I guess speaking of capital and bringing collective capital together on the continent, how much of that investment can come from within? Because previously we've seen some of the biggest infrastructure we've seen on the continent have been from China, and you've worked for some of the other like the European agencies or the big banks. How much potential is there for African investment on African infrastructure for basically to do what you're saying? Or are we also seeing, because we are seeing a lot of movement, where we say from the UAE has always been there. The US is also now moving towards more investment, less aid. But what does that mix look like?
So my view is that we should be smart and leverage all options available to us, whether it's investment from China, the US, Europe, the Gulf, and also investments internally that we also have. So I think when you look at the pension funds of many local pension funds in South Africa, which the PIC, for example, might is one of the largest pension funds, if not in the world, but definitely in Africa, collectively, and also in Kenya as well. There's a significant pension fund of I think over $10 billion in Nigeria, and also in many other francophone countries. These pension funds are there, so pretty much fund from people who are retired, and right now many of them invest in government sovereigns, in what they call risk-free assets, whereby they get 20% or plus in terms of the interest rates, because interest rates in different countries are high. So there's no incentive for them to look outside to say, okay, how should we should use these funds to invest also in infrastructure, in manufacturing, because when you look at the risk reward, and rightly so, sometimes it may not make sense. Why take that risk when you can get 20% doing nothing and you have at risk-free rate from the sovereigns that issue them. So I think there's a pool of capital that exists in Africa right now. It's not efficiently being utilized or allocated for various reasons, understandably so. But how do we potentially to help change it? And maybe that's where we have the role of, we've also heavily relied on DFIs and to invest in, especially on the private side. I think over 70% of investments in the private sector comes from the DFIs and MBBs, right? So the IFC, BRIs, the EBRs of these worlds, they play a big role in helping to have impact. They are the main private investors or go-to for infrastructure on the continent. But that's not sustainable because their funding exposed to influence of politics. So the funding really comes from the sovereigns themselves, whether the UK government or French government. And if the funding reduces, then that means there's an impact on the funding for infrastructure in Africa. And we can't afford to be very dependent on foreign sources to invest in infrastructure. But perhaps the best use of their funding, in my view, is to help to de-risk and enhance returns. So, for example, if you are a pension fund in Kenya or in South Africa, and you're concerned about the risk, the DFIs can potentially help play a role by providing first loss capital to help mobilize private at that scale. So they then also collaborate potentially with other international institutional investors from the US or from Asia, whereby the DFIs help to de-risk it. Right. So the concerns for international investors on the private sector is around Africa is too risky, currency risk. Does it make sense to them? And also, there's also a lack of knowledge as to what Africa is. In the infrastructure, I think according to Moody's, Africa has the second lowest default rates among other continents. So when you look at Latin America, Asia, the US, Africa has the second lowest default rates. I think the lowest might be the Middle East, followed by Africa. So there's also an issue of reality versus perception that we need to also demystify. But there is risk in Africa. We can't sugarcoat it, especially around currency risk, and also political risk. I talked about the frequent change in governments that potentially impact policies. But there's a role that DFIs and MBs can help play to risk and mitigate this risk, and make it attractive to mobilize capital, both externally from private sector, but also within our continent from the pension funds. So to answer your question, there is funding available on the continent to fund. I think we need to combine that funding, but also with international sources of funding because the gap is wide. I think I said earlier in my introductory remarks that it's an over $100 billion funding on the continent on an annual basis, right? So we need a lot more capital to ensure that we have those good roads, good airports, and good and more efficient ports.
I think I've heard the FDB, maybe you can also add, but I think the FDB does what you're saying, they de-risk those investments that I've seen, at least on the infrastructure side. But now just to bring on the other MDBs, when the investment comes in, how does policy play a role in how they deploy the funds? And by that I mean, like, who decides what kind of infrastructure would be invested in? Is it just what makes most profitable for the in there, or is there some push from the local governments to push for investments that they want or they need for the specific country? We'll take a break for now because that's a lot of information for us to process. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. And in part 2, we will come back and continue this conversation on energy and what the UAE's interests are on the continent of Africa, as well as the role of rare earths in the green transition and how countries like DR Congo and Zambia can play a pivotal role to improve their own infrastructure. So please join me for the second conversation with Ope on our next episode. Thank you.